The Decrypt said 42. Trevisan ran it 3 times and got 42 on every pass, and on the third pass her secondary heart stopped for exactly 1 beat, because 42 was a number that did not belong in the intercept she was holding. The intercept was a Tollan command pulse. It was the routine outbound signal of a Tollan strike wing, 12 heavy cruisers, 4 screen frigates, 2 carriers, broadcasting their daily order of battle to the Tollan Concorde's central node at Kara Lin. Kara Lin was the seat of the Concorde's High Admiralty. Kara Lin had ordered the strike wing to a sector designated only as Frame 8, a quiet shoulder of the outer reach where nothing useful was supposed to be. The pulse had taken 7 hours to reach the human listening post at Fendron, where Trevi sat on the 3rd night watch, with her hood up and her tertiary eye open and her primary eyes closed, reading the long thin numbers as they came in. She was not Tollan, she was Velith, a low-pressure species from a thin-air world the humans saw. Authority had pulled into its outer signals core 2 cycles ago, when a Velith mathematician on a backwater console had quietly broken a Concorde harmonic that 3 human cryptographers had failed to crack in 9 months. The humans had moved Trevi to Fendron, given her a junior analyst's chair, given her a hood that fit her thin skull, given her a quiet corner of the 3rd night watch, and told her, in the careful flat tone humans used with new species, that she was free to listen to anything she wanted, and that anything she heard she should bring to Chief Halcom at the end of her shift, and that nothing she heard would be acted on without 3 confirmations. The first night she had been afraid of the hood. The 3rd night she had stopped noticing it. The 100th night she had stopped noticing the room. Tonight, on the 412th night, the Decrypt said 42. 42 was the size of the Tollan strike. 12 plus 4 plus 2. 18 was the size of the Tollan strike wing. 42 was 24 ships too many. Trevi held her breath. She ran the pulse again. She fed the trail through the Concorde harmonic she had broken 2 cycles ago, the one the humans had quietly renamed the sand filter, and the filter came back with the same number, 42. Then it came back with a substring she had never seen before, 4 syllables long, riding low under the order of battle channel like a man whispering under a hymn. The substring said, "Frame 8 is a trap." She set the headset down. She set it down very carefully, the way her grandmother had set down a cracked bowl when she was a child, the way you set down anything that has just told you a thing you would rather not have been told. She walked the 4 meters from her console to the wall, and she leaned her thin forehead against the cool plating of the listening post, and she counted in her own language, in Velith formal, to 7. Then she walked back. She ran the trail a 5th time. The number was 42. The substring was the same. The Tollan Concorde was sending 42 ships to Frame 8. 24 of them were not on the Concorde's published order of battle. The Concorde was telling its own admiralty that it had sent 18. The Tollan Concorde, in other words, was lying to itself. The Tollan Concorde did not lie to itself. The Tollan Concord was a hive bureaucracy whose ruling caste shared a low-bandwidth thought current the Concord called the single voice. The single voice could not lie to itself. To do so would be to deafen itself. The single voice's whole virtue was that the upper castes of the Concorde all knew, at every moment, what the rest knew. That was the thing the Concorde built ships on. That was the thing the Concorde built empires on. The single voice had ruled the outer reach for 600 years. 42, said the single voice, was no longer single. 24 ships had been added by someone, under the noise floor, in a code older than the Concorde harmonic, in a frequency the Concorde's own scout band did not officially recognize. They were going to Frame 8. They were going to a sector where the human Sol Authority maintained a single quiet outpost, the 7th Wing's forward picket, 6 cutters and 1 tender, 140 crew, the smallest formation the humans had in the reach. Trevi looked at the substring again. Frame 8 is a trap. She picked up the headset. She put it back on. She walked to the duty terminal. She typed a flat brief into the runner queue, 8 lines, in the formal soul script Halcom had taught her in her 2nd month. She wrote the number 42 twice in the brief, once at the top and once at the bottom, in the way her Velith teachers had taught her to put the unbelievable thing in the place where it could not be missed. Then she stamped it with the 3rd night seal, and she pushed it into the queue, and the brief left her console, and the small green light on the side of her hood lit and went dark, and Trevi Sand sat in the chair on the 412th night, and waited for the chief to read it. The chief read it at 0312 station time. The chief read it at 0312, and at 0314 the chief was on the floor of the watchroom in his sleeping shirt and his uniform jacket, and his boots without socks. And at 0316, he had 3 of the other analysts up and at their consoles. And at 032, the brief had been countersigned and uploaded to the courier line. And at 0322, the courier line had begun the long lift up the chain. Fendron to Lavender Reach to Brisson Spire to the Sole Authority Command at Tannehill, where the desk officers of the Night Watch took it and read it and put it on the morning pile for the day shift, where the day shift read it and tagged it Analyst Theory, and put it on the afternoon pile for the senior officers, where the senior officers read it and tagged it Single Source, and put it on the next morning's pile for the deputy. The deputy read it the next morning. The deputy was a Sol Authority captain named Eleazar Briel. He was a man who had risen in the cold years after the Outer Reach Treaty, and who believed 2 things about the universe more strongly than he believed anything else. He believed the Tollan Concord could not lie to itself. He believed that any signal that contradicted the Concord's published order of battle was, by definition, noise. Captain Briel read Trevisan's brief and tagged it noise. He signed under the tag in his neat, tight hand, and he sent the brief on to the archive without forwarding it to the Admiralty. Trevi found out at the end of the next watch, when the courier line bounced her brief back with a flat green stamp. Noise archived, no action. She sat at her console with the bounce in her hand, and she did not move for a long time. The watchroom was quiet around her. The other analysts had finished their shifts. The third night light was burning. Outside the small, narrow viewport above her console, she could see the slow turn of the Fendron station, and beyond it the long, thin curve of the gas. Giant the post orbited, lit pale orange along its leading edge. The orange light came through the viewport and lay on her console in a thin, slow bar, and she watched it for the length of 7 breaths. Then she ran the intercept again. The number was 42. The substring was the same. Frame 8 is a trap. She filed it again. She filed it the next night. She filed it on the 3rd night with a long mathematical appendix attached, in which she walked the chain from the raw pulse through the sand filter and into the underchannel and out again, with every step shown, in a way she had been taught that no one could disagree with. Captain Briel tagged the 2nd brief noise. He tagged the 3rd brief noise. Analyst persistent, see me. He flew out to Fendron himself on the 4th day. He arrived in his greatcoat and his cap and his neat, tight hand, and he stood in the watchroom in front of Trevi's console, and he asked her, in a calm, flat voice, whether she understood that the Tollan Concord could not lie to itself. Trevi looked at him. The hood was up. Her tertiary eye was open. She said in her careful soul formal that she understood the proposition. She said she had reread the proposition 7 times. She said the data did not match the proposition. Captain Briel said the data was noise. Trevi said the data was 42. Captain Briel said that one Velith analyst on a 3rd night watch did not get to overturn 600 years of doctrine on the strength of a single intercept. Trevi said it was not 1 intercept. It was 4. It was the same number every night. It was the same substring every night. The trap word was the same word in the same band under the same noise floor on 4 consecutive Concord pulses. Captain Briel looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the orange bar of light on her console, and then he looked at the small green 3rd night seal beside her hand. Then he said, in the very calm, flat voice of a man who has decided what he is going to do, that he was reassigning her to the day watch. He said in a kind voice. He said the day watch was a better watch. He said she would be more rested. Trevi said she did not want to be reassigned. She said the Concord pulse arrived on the 3rd night. Captain Briel said the reassignment stood. He said the brief stood archived. He said the single voice did not lie. He said he was sorry, and his voice when he said it was not unkind, but he was also a man who had made up his mind. And he turned and he walked out of the watchroom, and he flew back to Tannehill on the morning shuttle. Trevi sat at her console after he left, and she watched the orange bar of light move across the metal. She thought of her grandmother and the cracked bowl. She thought of 7 and 17 and 42. She thought of the substring in the underchannel, and of the 7th Wing 6 cutters and 1 tender and 140 crew sitting in their quiet picket at the edge of frame 8, with the leading edge of a hidden Tollan armada riding under the Concord's noise floor toward them, and the Sol Authority's deputy back at Tannehill tagging her brief noise. She stood up. She took off the hood. She walked the 4 meters to Chief Halcom's office, and she stood at the doorway, and she did not knock. Halcom was at his desk. He had the bounce back on his blotter. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She said, in her careful soul formal, that she was going to file a 5th brief. She said she was going to file it tonight, on the third night, and she was going to file it on the courier line marked operational, which bypassed the day watch desks and went directly to the Admiralty floor at Tanhill, and which a junior analyst on a third night watch was not authorized to use without a chief's counter-signature. She said she was asking him to countersign. Halcombe looked at her for a long count. Halcombe was a thin gray man who had been on Fendron for 14 cycles. He had been a lieutenant in the cold years, and a captain in the warm years, and a chief in the long years between. He did not believe everything his analysts told him. He believed he had told Trevi once in the first month, in the things that came back with the same number on the 7th check. Halcombe said, "How many checks?" Trevi said, "7. Halcombe said, "Each pulse?" Trevi said, "Each pulse." Halcombe said, 42. Halcombe said, "And the substring?" Trevi said, "Frame 8 is a trap, 4 times. Same band, same noise floor, same harmonic." Halcombe said, "And the deputy?" Trevi said, "Tagged noise, 3 times, once in person." Halcombe said, "And you want me to put my chief seal on a brief that says the single voice is no longer single?" Trevi said, "Yes, sir." Halcombe said, "On operational?" Trevi said, "Yes, sir." Halcombe said, "Knowing what that costs me if you're wrong?" Trevi said, "Knowing." Halcombe sat for one more breath. Then he opened the top drawer of his desk and he took out a small dark stamp and he stamped the bottom of Trevi's draft 5th brief without reading it, and he handed it back to her and he said, "File it on operational. Tell them I countersigned. Tell them I countersigned because the analyst said 7. Trevi took the brief. She did not bow. The Velith did not bow. She set the heel of her thin right hand against the door frame in the gesture her grandmother had taught her, for thanks, for a thing too large to thank. And she walked back to her console and she filed the brief. The brief left Fendron at 0411 station time on the 416th night. It hit Tannehill's Admiralty floor at 11:08 station time the next day. The duty admiral was a woman named Inez Corva. Admiral Corva was 63 years old. She had commanded a frigate division in the cold years, and she had taught at the Sole Authorities War College for a decade, and she had read 14,000 briefs in her career. And one of the things she had taught her cadets over and over was that the briefs that mattered were the briefs that came in on operational with a third night counter signature, because nobody used operational unless somebody had run the check 7 times and then stood at a doorway and asked the chief to risk his career. Corva read the brief. She read it twice. She read the appendix. She read the number 42 and the substring frame 8 is a trap. She read the line at the bottom that said, "Chief countersigned because analyst said 7. Then she stood up. She did not call the deputy. She did not call Captain Brielle. She walked down the corridor to the war room, and she put the brief on the table, and she said, in her old steady voice, "Get me the 7th wing." The 7th wing's forward picket sat at the rim of frame 8 in the cold, quiet shoulder of the outer reach. 6 cutters and 1 tender and 140 crew, and they had been there for 11 months without a relief. The picket commander was a Sole Authority lieutenant commander named Hadrian Murr. He was 38. He had 3 children he had not seen for a year. He kept a small framed image of them on the bulkhead above his bunk. He had been told, in his last orders packet, that frame 8 was a quiet sector, and that he should expect no traffic before the end of the cycle, and that his picket was there to listen and to log and to wait. Hadrian Murr was asleep in his quarters at 2:14 picket time when the priority alert came in on the courier band. He came out of the bunk in one motion. He read the alert by the red light over his desk. He read it twice. He stood for one breath with the alert in his hand. Then he walked to the bridge in his sleeping shirt and his trousers and his sidearm, and he stood at the captain's station and he said in a flat voice, "Battle stations. All 6. Cold start. Tender stays in the lee. Listen on Concord band. He ensures filter Basan." The bridge crew looked at him. He said, "Move." They moved. The cutters of the 7th wing came up to battle stations between 214 and 2-1. The tender, the Pell, was tucked behind the gas giant they had been hiding in the lee of for 11 months. The cutters were named the Whisper, the Whetstone, the Long Cold, the Watchman, the Iron Verdict's old sister, the Iron Quiet, and Murr's own flag, the Salt Lamp. They were small ships. They were old. They were faster than they looked and quieter than they should have been, and they had been built in the cold years for exactly the work they were doing now, which was to sit on the rim of a sector nobody believed mattered and to listen. At 0231, the Whisper's signals officer, a junior lieutenant named Ova Drell, reported a band shift on the Concord Scout net. She reported it in the new flat way Murr had asked them all to report, No preamble, no hedging. She said, Concord band, low under channel. 4 syllables repeating, my best read is frame 8 assembly, 216 seconds from now. Mer said, confidence. Drell said, 7. Sir. Mer said, hold. 216 seconds later, the first Tollan cruiser dropped out of the underfold, half a light second off the Whisper's bow. It was followed by the second cruiser and the third and the fourth. They came in the standard Tollan combat lattice, the 4x4x2 lattice the Concorde had used for 600 years. They came in at full sprint. They came in with their primary weapons hot, in a formation built to cross the picket from one side and roll it over without a fight. And what they expected to find when they crossed was 6 small cutters and 1 tender at low readiness, sleep in their lee. What they found was 6 small cutters at battle stations, dispersed in a staggered 3-axis screen Murr had drawn on a napkin 3 weeks ago and never explained to anyone, with the tender already lifting on a long curve out of the lee and broadcasting on a band the Concorde could not hear. The Concorde lattice hit the screen at 0234 picket time. The Concorde had expected an unprepared sleeping rim picket. The Concorde had not expected the Whetstone's forward lance to be already tracking the lead cruiser's bridge module. The Concorde had not expected the long cold to be sitting on the underfold exit point itself, with her electromagnetic profile cold enough that the lead cruiser registered her in the first half-second after exit as a piece of cold ice and not a ship. The Concorde had not expected the Whisper to be running a counter-tap on the underchannel and feeding the lead cruiser's own command pulse back into the Concorde lattice, with 3 syllables changed, so that the second wave of Concorde cruisers, dropping out of full 90 seconds behind the first, received an order in their own captain's voice, telling them to break formation and reform along the long axis. On the bridge of the lead cruiser, the Tollan flag captain was a thick-shouldered male of the second caste named Carovell. He had been ordered into frame 8 by a pulse he had received privately on the Concorde scout band from a faction officer at Cara Lynn whose name he did not know. He had been told by the unknown faction officer that the strike was a discipline action against a small, unprepared human picket on the rim, that the picket would not be at battle stations, that the Concorde's main admiralty had been told a different number for political reasons that need not concern him, and that he was to take the picket cleanly and quietly and fold home. Carovell had been told the small lie of the single voice. He had accepted the small lie because in the Concorde, one accepted the small lies of the single voice as the price of standing in it. He realized he had been told a small lie at 0234 and 21 seconds when the Whetstone's forward lance came through the deck below his bridge and unmade the helm. He realized he had been told a much larger lie at 0234 and 26 seconds when his own command voice, 3 syllables altered, went out across the lattice and broke the second wave's formation before he could countermand it. He did not have time to realize anything else. His bridge was a tube of flame for 1 second and a tube of cold vacuum for the next, and the Whetstone's forward lance, on its second pulse, took the bridge module from the cruiser as cleanly as a knife takes a cap from a bottle, and the bridge module went away into the dark trailing fragments of the helm and the long Concorde rail along which the second caste captains had hung their hands for 600 years. The second wave's senior captain was a female of the third caste named Sinon, and she received the altered command in her own captain's voice at 0235 and 9 seconds. She heard the words, break formation, reform along long axis in the exact cadence Carovell used when he gave orders he had decided in advance and not in council, and she broke formation. She broke formation cleanly, the way the Concorde trained the third caste to break formation when the second caste ordered it. She presented her cold flanks to the cold dark the way the third caste was trained to do, and the cold dark on this morning contained the iron quiet. Senior Lieutenant Vincel had been waiting for the long axis reform for 3 weeks. She had not been told it would come. She had been told by Mer in a private conversation in the wardroom of the Salt Lamp 11 months before that if the Concorde ever came through frame 8 in numbers, it would come in a 4x4x2 lattice, and that if anything broke that lattice midfold, the third caste would reform on the long axis, because that was what the third caste did when surprised, and that the long axis was the cold flank, and that the cold flank was where she would stand. Vincel had brought a folded napkin to that wardroom conversation. She had drawn the cold flank on it in pencil. She had kept the napkin in her breast pocket for 11 months. She did not look at the napkin at 0235 and 9 seconds. She did not need to. The cold flank was where she had been told it would be. She fired the railgun. The Iron Quiet had a single railgun. It was an old gun. It had been built in the cold years by a foreman on Pavnar named Tirsa Veen, who had welded the gun's primary rail by hand because the welding rig on Pavnar had been older than the foreman herself. The gun, Tirsa Veen had told the captain at commissioning, was a one-time gun. It would fire once in a battle, exactly correctly, and after that it would need 3 days in dock to be retrued. Vincel had carried that knowledge for 19 months. She had been waiting all 19 months for the one time. The one time was now. The slug from the Iron Quiet's railgun crossed the cold flank at fractional light. It struck the lead cruiser of the second wave, Sinon's flag, at the seam where, 600 years ago, the Concorde shipyards on Karolin had begun welding their cruisers along a single longitudinal weld because the Concorde shipyards had been unable, at the founding, to weld a curve. The seam had never been re-engineered. The Concorde had never been forced to re-engineer it. The seam had held against every threat the Concorde had faced in 600 years, and the seam now met the Iron Quiet slug. The cruiser opened. The cruiser opened along the full length of the longitudinal seam, from the bow to the engine ring, in a slow, clean line, like a paper bag drawn open with a wet thumb. The atmosphere went out through the line. The crew went out through the line. The bridge of the cruiser, which sat at the bow above the seam, lifted away from the rest of the ship in one piece and drifted, intact, with its lights still burning, into the cold drift the long cold had seeded 3 days before. The lights flickered. The lights went out. Sinon, in the drifting bridge, had time. The captain of the 811 frigate would later tell his crew at the Concorde Council to look once at her panel and once at the dark beyond her viewport, and once, for a long count, at nothing. Then the cold took her. The third cast had not been trained to die on a long axis. The third cast had been told there was no long axis at which they would have to die. The pieces of Sinon's cruiser drifted, in the slow, clean way the longitudinal seam had taught them to drift, into the second cruiser of the second wave. The second cruiser, attempting to maneuver around the pieces of her flag, pieces she still, in the underband, registered as her flag, because the Concord lattice was not designed for the flag of the third cast to come up apart, presented her starboard flank to the whisper. The second wave broke formation. They reformed along the long axis. They presented their cold flanks to the Iron Quiet, which had been waiting for them. The first cruiser took a forward lance through the bridge module at 0234 and 21 seconds. The second cruiser took a forward lance through the engine ring at 0234 and 40 seconds. The third cruiser, attempting to swing wide and bring its broadsides on the whetstone, swung into the cold drift. The long cold had been seeding into the sector for 3 days, in which the long cold had quietly mapped onto the Concorde lattice's primary recoil arc. The cold drift took the third cruiser's port engines. The third cruiser staggered. The salt lamp came in along the long axis and put 2 ranging lances into the staggered cruiser's bridge and 1 into its magazine, and the third cruiser went away in a slow white bloom that lit up the back of the gas giant for a full second before the dark came back. By 0236, the first wave of Tollan cruisers, 12 ships, was down to 7. By 0238, it was down to 4. By 0241, it was down to 1, and the 1 was running. The second wave, 16 ships, the hidden ones Trevi had counted in the underchannel, came out of fold at 0242 in the wrong formation into the cold flanks the Iron Quiet had been waiting on. The Iron Quiet was a small ship. She had 4 lances and a single railgun and a crew of 19. She had been built in a yard on Pavnar in the cold years by a foreman who had told her first captain, at her commissioning, that she had been built to do one thing exactly right one time. The Iron Quiet's captain, a senior lieutenant named Sarah Vincel, had been waiting 11 months for the one time. Vincel put her railgun through the lead cruiser of the second wave at 0242 in 12 seconds, and the lead cruiser came apart in 3 pieces along the long seam every Tollan cruiser had been welded along since the Concorde's founding. The pieces drifted into the second cruiser of the second wave. The second cruiser, attempting to maneuver around the wreckage, presented its starboard flank to the Whisper, which had been counter-tapping the underchannel, and which now turned its single forward lance through the second cruiser's command bridge. By 0245, the second wave was down to 10. The third cruiser of the second wave was a heavy hull called the Veil, commanded by a thin senior captain of the second cast named Aramtas. Aramtas had been a captain for 31 cycles. He had fought in the Tolan-Vrelish border wars in his first decade, And in the cold cataloging expeditions of his second decade, and in the Concorde, long quiet enforcement of the trade lanes through his third, and he had never in any of those engagements lost more than a single ship. He read the lattice on his board at ZO240, and he did not believe it. He read it again. The lattice was gone. The flag was gone. The second flag was gone. The cold flank was open. Aram Taz had been trained in his first decade by an old captain of the second caste, who had taught him that when a Concorde lattice broke, the surviving captains were to converge on the nearest fold exit and fold home in formation. Because the Concorde did not lose battles, the Concorde lost ships. Aram Taz opened his underband to call the convergence. The underband came back with a sound that was not a Tollan voice. It was a thin, low, four-syllable substring repeating under a wash of static. The substring said, "We hear you." Aram Taz, in 31 cycles, had never heard that substring. He did not know what it meant. He did not on the spot know how to respond to it. He looked at his underband officer. The underband officer looked at him with all four of her eyes wide. He keyed his command voice. He said, "In Concorde formal, all surviving hulls converge on fold exit alpha and fold home in formation." The underband took his order. It rephrased the order. The order that went out across the lattice in his own voice said, "All surviving hulls, present cold flanks to the dark, and hold." Aram Taz heard his own voice, 3 syllables altered, in his own ear. He understood in the second half of one breath that the Concorde harmonic had been broken. He understood in the first half of the next breath that the small lie of the single voice had been a much larger lie than he had believed, and that whoever had sent him to frame 8 had sent him not to discipline a picket, but to die quietly inside a noise floor that was being read by a species the Concorde had not catalogued. He keyed his sidearm. He stood up from his captain's chair. He walked to the rail above the bridge, and he put his thin sixth hand on the rail in the gesture of a captain who has decided that his ship will not fold home, because his ship cannot fold home without folding the lie home with it. And he gave one last order in his own voice on the open band in the clean Concorde his old captain had taught him in his first decade. He said, "To any Tollan who can hear me, we were lied to. The lattice will not reform. Do not return to Carolyn. Run dark to Brel, where the third caste will hear you. The Concorde at Carolyn will not." Then the veil took a forward lance from the watchman through her bridge module, and Aram Taz, who had been right about 3 things and wrong about 31 cycles worth of doctrine, did not have to give another order. The Tollan captain of the 811 frigate, who would later carry the human commander's message to Kara Lynn, was on the open band when Aram Taz spoke. He heard him. He wrote down what he heard. He set the slip of paper inside the small breast pocket of his tunic, behind the Concorde crest, where the Concorde searchers, when they boarded his hull at Kara Lynn 3 weeks later, would not think to look. By 0250 the second wave was down to 6. By 0252 the carriers, which had stayed at the back of the second wave in the way Concorde carriers always did, had attempted to fall back into fold. The long cold was sitting on their fold exit point. They could not fall back into the fold they had come in on without crossing the cold drift she had seeded. They tried anyway. The first carrier went into the cold drift at 0253 and lost her primary fold coil. The second carrier turned at 253 and 10 seconds and ran for the open quadrant, and the salt lamp had read the Concorde's secondary carrier doctrine in the War College 12 years ago, and Hadrian Murr was on the bridge of the salt lamp now, and he had been 38 for 1 year, and he had 3 children, and he was not on this morning in any mood to let a Concorde carrier run for the open. He took the salt lamp across the second carrier's escape arc and put 4 lances into the carrier's engine ring in a pattern Murr himself had drawn on the same napkin he had drawn the screen on 3 weeks ago, and the second carrier opened along its keel and bled. On the Whisper, the signals officer Ovidrel had not moved from her station in 50 minutes. She had not, she realized, at 0254, eaten in 11 hours. She had not slept in 19. She had taken the band shift report at a 231, and she had been on the underchannel since, reading the Concorde lattice's whispered fractures one at a time, feeding altered command pulses back into the underband the way Trevisan at Fendron had taught her to, on a long, flat instructional pulse Drell had received 11 months ago through the courier chain, with a note that read, in the formal soul script, "Filter Sand Junior Analyst, 3rd night 7 checks, believe." Drell had believed. She had run the sand filter through the Whisper's signal stacked the day she had arrived at frame 8. She had argued with Murr about it for an hour in the wardroom. Murr had finally signed the change order in his neat, tight hand, and Drell had bolted the filter into the stack, and the filter had sat quiet for 11 months. Tonight at 0231, the filter had spoken. Tonight at 0234, the filter had let her cut 3 syllables out of a Tollan command voice and put them back in altered, and the Concord lattice had broken on the altered syllables. Tonight at 0254, with the filter still running, Drell was reading the carrier's cold fallback orders and feeding them into a band the carrier's captains thought was private, and the carrier's captains were giving each other orders they had not given. She did not feel tired. She felt the way her mother had told her when she was a child a fisher felt when the run came up the river. A long, quiet competence with the morning sun on it. She felt, for the first time since she had taken the Whisper's signals chair, that she was at the right station on the right night. She keyed the open band. She said in her flat voice, "Salt Lamp Whisper, the third carrier is broadcasting fallback on Concord 6. I have her routing as the open quadrant. She does not know we hear her. Recommend the salt lamp take her across the long curve." Mur said, "Take her." The salt lamp took her. The third carrier did not know what crossed her until the salt lamp's lances were in her engine ring, and even then, the third carrier's captain, a second cast officer named Pelvor, believed for a count of 3 that his coil failure was a Tollan side malfunction. He keyed the underband to call for repair support. The underband came back with the same 4 syllables it had given Aramtaz. "We hear you." Pelvor sat at his rail and did not, in the count of 1 breath, know what to do. He had not been trained for a battle in which the underband heard him. The underband had been a Tollan band for 600 years. He keyed the broadband. He said, in Concord formal, "Sol Authority, Salt Lamp. The Pelvor command requests stand down. Our coils are out. Our broadsides are cold. We ask for honor," Mur said in his flat, steady voice. "Honor granted. Open your hatches. The Pel will board." The Vor opened her hatches. The Pel tender, which had taken on 191 Tollan wounded from the Vela in the preceding 19 minutes, drifted alongside the Vor and her medics, 6 humans, 2 Velith, and now a Tollan-speaking corpsman from the Salt Lamp's own complement, a junior corpsman named Kalanim, who had spent a year of her academy life learning Concord formal because she had thought, in her second year, that she might one day need to speak it to a wounded captain in a small bay. Went aboard in their soft suits with their soft kits, and Kalanim, 18 years old, stood at the rail above Pelvor's bridge and spoke to him in clean Concord formal and asked him, in the cadence of the third cast, whether his coils were the only injury. Pelvor looked at her. Pelvor was 61. He had a daughter in the Concord's medical service at Carolyn. He had 3 grandchildren he had seen last at the long autumn festival on Brell. He said, "The coils are the only injury. My crew is intact. We were not prepared for the cold." Kalanim said in her clean Concord formal, "The cold is a weather of this sector. You were not told. We will treat your crew. We will not catalog them as captives. You will be lifted to a neutral hold and you will be folded home when the Concord asks for you." Pelvor sat for a long count. He said, "May I ask, Junior Corpsman, why you speak Concord formal?" Kalanim said, "Because I thought I would one day need to." Pelvor closed his second eye. He bowed his thick head the way the third cast bowed when the second cast had been corrected by a junior. He did not say anything else. The Vor's crew was lifted. The cold morning at Frame 8, which had begun at 0214 with battle stations on the cutter The Whisper, was 4 hours and 36 minutes long from first scan to last broadside, and at 254 it was, by every accountancy the Sol Authority kept 1. It was not by every accountancy the Sol Authority kept finished. Because at 0257 on the Whisper's signal stack, Ovidrell heard the underchannel turnover. The break was small. It was a pulse shift of a kind she had been trained by a long, flat instructional recording from a junior analyst at Fendron to call out the second she heard it. The pulse shift had a name in the Send Filter's calibration sheet. The name was Third Cast Convergence. It meant a second flag had been raised. It meant the carrier's Trevisan had counted in the underchannel. The ones that had folded in at 0242 were not the second wave. They were the front of the second wave. There was a wave behind them. There was, behind the wave behind them, the thing the Concord did not name on open band, and the thing the Concord at Carolyn had quietly walked into the cold of Frame 8 to keep secret. There was the true fleet of the third cast. Drell read the pulse. She read it twice. She keyed her open band. She said in her flat voice, in the cadence she had used at 0231 and 0234 and at 245, without any change of pitch at all, "Salt Lamp Whisper. Convergence at the underchannel. Third cast. Count rising. I have at minimum 40 hulls. Mer said repeat, Drell repeated. Mer said confirm count. Drell said 40, 43, 47. Climbing, Mer did not, for a count of one breath, say anything. The Salt Lamps bridge was a small bridge. It had a single forward port. The port looked out. That morning, on the back of the gas giant the squadron had used as a fold anchor, and the back of the gas giant was lit on its long curve by the slow white bloom that was the dying third cruiser of the first wave. Mer looked at the bloom. Mer had 3 children. Mer had been 38 for 1 year. Mer had drawn the screen for frame 8 on a napkin in a wardroom 3 weeks ago, and he had drawn the screen for a single wave, because the brief from the Sol Authority had said 1 wave. The brief had been wrong. Mer keyed the squadron band. He said in his flat, steady voice, all hulls. Salt Lamp. The second wave is not the second wave. Third cast is converging on the underchannel. I have a count climbing past 50. Reconfigure to the long axis. Iron quiet. Fall back to the whetstone's flank. Long cold. Hold the cold drift on the fold. Exit. Whisper. Keep reading. He said, we are not going to win the next 30 minutes. We are going to last them. On the bridge of the whetstone, the senior officer of the deck, a woman named Inka, who had been at the War College 12 years ago with Mer, and who had not in 12 years ever once heard him use the word last in an order, looked at her captain. Her captain, a tall woman named Holst, looked at the port. Holst said, in her quiet voice, reconfigure. The whetstone reconfigured. The iron quiet, which had a crew of 19 and a single railgun, fell back. Sarah Vinsel, the senior lieutenant, stood at her rail and watched the underband count climb past 60 on the secondary panel and did not, in the count of 3 breaths, change her expression. She had been waiting 11 months for the one time. She had used the one time at Su-242. She did not know, in the next count of breaths, what she was supposed to use now. She looked at her underband officer, a junior named Pesh, and she said in her dry voice, tell the foreman on Pavner if you ever see him. The iron quiet did the one thing twice. Pesh said, aye, Captain. The iron quiet's railgun cycled. At 0301, the third cast came out of fold. They did not come out the way the second wave had come out. They came out in the long Concorde formation that had not been seen on any open band since the cold cataloging expeditions of the previous century. The formation had a name in the War College's classified annex. The name was the Hand. It opened in 5 fingers across 200,000 kilometers, and it closed when the lattice held on the thing it was opening at. The Hand was not a battle formation. The Hand was an erasure formation. It had been used twice in Concorde history, once at Vrelis, where the Concorde had erased a colony of 7 million for a heresy the Concorde had not catalogued, and once at the long, quiet enforcement of the trade lane at Brel, where the Concorde had erased a freighter fleet of 31 hulls. Because the freighters had been carrying a third cast manifest the second cast had not authorized. The Hand had never been used on a known belligerent. It had been used only on quiet things, and only with the second flag down. The second flag was down at frame 8. The Concorde at Carolyn had not raised it back. The Hand opened. It opened on the squadron. It opened with 71 hulls in the 5 fingers, and the 71 hulls were all third cast heavies, and they moved on the underband the sand filter had broken at 0234. The underband the third cast did not know was broken. The underband Ova Drell had been reading for 27 minutes. The way a fisher reads a river. Drell read the Hand. She read the lattice the third cast was using to coordinate the closing. The lattice was a third cast lattice. The sand filter had been calibrated at Fendron against second cast pulses. The third cast pulses were different. They were slower. They were warmer. They had a 4-syllable substring in them that the sand filter on the calibration sheet had been told to flag and not to alter, because the calibration sheet's author, a junior analyst on his third night in the basement at Fendron, had written in his small, careful hand, third cast under channel. Do not alter. Read only. The third cast are not the enemy. They are the witnesses. Drell had read the line 11 months ago. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. She keyed the open band. She said, Salt Lamp. Whisper. The third cast is converging. The lattice is open to read. I am not altering. Recommend the squadron open a clean band to the third cast and speak Concord formal. Mer said, speak it yourself. Drell did not. In the count of 1 breath, move. She had not in 19 months on the Whisper ever spoken on an open band to an enemy hull. She had been a signals officer. She had read. She had filtered. She had not spoken. She keyed the clean band. She set it to the third cast under channel's carrier frequency. She set the sand filter on her console to read only. She breathed in. She spoke. in the clean conquered formal she had learned in her academy years, from a quiet instructor who had once told her that the Concord's third caste, when they were spoken to in their own register, listened, she said, "Third caste of the Concord. This is the cutter whisper of the Sol authority. Your second caste command has lied to you. Your second flag was lowered by the Karalin authority and was not raised again. You have been sent to frame 8 inside a lie. We have heard the lie on the underband. We have a Tollan captain in our hold, Pelvor of the Vor, who will testify. We have a senior captain of the second caste, Aramtaz of the Vale, who keyed his sidearm and stood up from his chair when he understood. We do not ask you to surrender. We ask you to listen. The hand is an erasure formation. You have been told you are erasing a picket. You are not erasing a picket. You are erasing the witnesses to the lie." She did not, in the next count of breaths, key the band closed. She left it open. The whisper signal stack carried her voice on the third caste carrier into 71 bridges, and the 71 bridges, all of them, heard her in the warm, slow cadence of their own register, because the sand filter had read the third caste channel, and the sand filter had passed her, voice through the third caste channel unaltered. On the third caste flagship, a long, low, heavy hull called the Coral, commanded by a senior captain of the third caste named Oruvel. The underband officer, a junior of the third caste named Talish, raised her thick gray head from her console and looked at her captain. Oruvel was 91 cycles old. He had been at Vrelis. He had been at Brel. He had stood at the rail of his bridge at Brel in the cold cataloging expedition of his second decade, and he had watched 31 freighters open along their long seams under a hand he had himself ordered, and he had carried, in the small breast pocket of his tunic, for 61 cycles since, a single slip of paper on which he had written, in his own careful hand, the manifest of the freighters he had erased. He had carried the slip because he had wanted to remember. He had remembered. He had not, in 61 cycles, spoken to anyone about the slip. He had not in 61 cycles raised the lattice he was about to raise now. He looked at Talish. He said, in his slow voice, in the warm third caste cadence, "Junior, confirm the second flag." Talish keyed her underband. She read the trace. She read it twice. She read it a third time because the trace was a thing she had not, in her 7 cycles in the underband chair, ever been asked to confirm. She said, "Captain, the second flag was lowered at Karalin at the 3rd hour of the previous evening. It was not raised again. The order to frame 8 carries the first flag only. The underband of the second caste at the Vale, before it went dark, registered a substring I do not catalog." Oruvel said, "Read the substring." Talish, "Read it." She said, "We hear you." Oruvel closed his second eye. He stood slowly from his captain's rail. He walked to the forward port of the Coral, and he looked out at the long curve of the gas giant, lit on its back by the small dying blooms of his second caste's wave, and he put his thick 6th hand on the rail in the gesture of a captain of the third caste who has, on the open band in front of his crew, decided that the hand will not close. He keyed his command voice. He spoke in clean third caste Concord formal on the open band into all 71 bridges. He said, "Third caste of the Coral lattice. The second flag is down. The order is void. The hand will not close. We will hold our positions. We will not fire on the Sol Authority's squadron. We will not fire on the second caste's wreckage. We will open our hatches to the Sol Authority's medical tenders, and we will receive instruction in our own cadence. The lie that brought us here will not be carried home in our hulls," he said. "Talesh, open the Coral's hatches." Talesh opened them. The 70 hulls behind the Coral opened theirs in a slow, unfolding wave that took, on the squadron's tactical board, 11 minutes to register from the first hull at the index finger of the hand to the last hull at the thumb. By 03 the hand had unfolded into a long, quiet line, and the long, quiet line was sitting in the cold of frame 8 with all of its broadsides cold, and all of its hatches open, and the salt lamp, the whetstone, the long cold, the iron quiet, the watchman, the Pell, and the whisper sat across the frame from them in the squadron's reconfigured long axis with all of their lances cold as well. Hadrian Mayer, on the bridge of the salt lamp, looked at his tactical board. He said, "Confirm." The signals officer of the salt lamp, a junior named Ress, said, "Confirmed." 71 hulls, all hatches open. The Coral is broadcasting on clean third caste band. The flag is down, Merced. Open the band. Ress opened it. Mer keyed his voice. He said in his flat, steady voice, in the clean Concord formal he had learned in his academy years, from the same quiet instructor Drell had learned hers from, "Coral, salt lamp. The Sol Authority receives the third caste. We will send tenders. We will not catalog your crews as captives. We will lift your wounded. We will hold the lie at frame 8, in the cold, on the underband, until your third cast raises the second flag at Kara Lynn in your own register. We will then return your hulls, Oruvel said, in his slow, warm voice. Salt Lamp Coral, we receive, he said. Captain of the Salt Lamp. May I ask, in the open band, where the third cast's witness was prepared, who taught the Sol Authority the third cast cadence? Mer said, an analyst, a junior. A long, flat instructional pulse received 11 months ago through the courier chain. The pulse carried a calibration sheet. The calibration sheet was signed by a junior analyst on his third night at a Sol station I will not name. The analyst was right about 7 checks. We believed him. Oruvel closed his second eye again. He bowed his thick head, the way the third cast bowed when a junior of an uncatalogued species had corrected a doctrine of 61 cycles. He said, in his slow voice, tell the analyst when you see him that the third cast at frame 8 heard him. Mer said, the clean band closed on the whisper. Ovadrel sat in her signals chair for a long count without moving. Her hands were on the console. Her underband was reading the long quiet line of opened hulls and was reading no pulses on any frequency anywhere in the frame. The frame was, for the first time since 214, quiet. She heard in the quiet the small sounds of her own ship, the hum of the signal stack, the soft clicks of the sand filter's calibration loop, the breath of Peshawillan Jr. at the next console, who had not, in 19 hours, slept either. She put her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes. She thought for one count of one breath of her mother on the river at Pavnar with the morning sun on the run. The cold morning at frame 8, which had begun at 214 with battle stations on the cutter the Whisper, and which had been, by every accountancy the Sol Authority kept, one at 0254 and finished at 0314, was by 316 over. It was not, by every accountancy any third cast witness at Karolin would later keep, over for a long time. At Fendron Listening Station in the basement on the inland side, 3 weeks after frame 8, the junior intelligence analyst Trevi San walked the long corridor from the canteen to his console at the start of his shift. He carried a cup of cheap station tea in his lower right hand. He carried a thin folder under his upper left. The folder was the night's brief. It had been delivered at the change of shift in the small wire tray on the corner of his desk. He had not, at shift change, read it. He had gone to the canteen. He sat down. He set the cup on the small ring of cup stains his cup had made in the desk's surface over 11 months. He opened the folder. The folder had a single sheet in it. The sheet had a header. The header read, in the Sol Authority's clean black block, Sol Authority Eyes Only, Frame 8, Courier 41. The brief was 3 paragraphs long. He read the first paragraph. He read the second. He read the third. He set the folder down. He did not in the next count of 3 breaths move. He had in his second week at Fendron written a small note on a slip of paper. He had folded the slip and taped it to the underside of his desk center drawer, on the side facing him, where he could see it when he opened the drawer. The slip had a single line on it in his own small, careful hand. The line read, "The third cast are not the enemy. They are the witnesses." He had taped the slip up because he had wanted, on the long nights when the brief was tagged noise and his checks had not been believed, to remember that he had once believed it. He opened the drawer. The slip was still there. He closed the drawer. He picked up the cup of tea. He took one slow sip. He set the cup back on the ring of cup stains. He did not on this morning begin. He keyed his console. The console came up. The console had, on its corner, a small flag indicator that read, in the soft yellow he had set it, to 11 months ago when the courier chain had carried the long, flat instructional pulse out to the Whisper, the single word pulse. The flag indicator was off. The pulse had been received. At the small desk by the corridor door, the senior duty officer for the basement, a quiet old man named Merrick, who had once been an intelligence officer on a hull called the Lantern, looked up from his ledger. He looked across the basement at Trevi San. He did not, for a long count, say anything. Then he closed his ledger. He set his pen across the spine. He stood up. He walked the length of the basement corridor, past the long row of consoles where the night analysts had not yet come on shift, past the wire trays and the small ring of cup stains on every desk, and he stopped at the side of Trevi San's desk. He put one old hand lightly on the corner of the desk. He said in his quiet voice 3 words. He said, "You were right." Then he walked back to his ledger. Trevi San sat at his console in the basement at Fendron, with the cup cooling at his lower right hand, and the brief that had been tagged noise open on the desk in front of him, and the slip taped to the underside of the drawer at his knee. And he began in his own small, careful hand the 7 checks of the morning shift. Outside, above the long flat roof of the station, the inland sun came up over the cold blue dawn of the Pavnar plain. The cup of tea went cold. The shift began.